everyone, and welcome to Lifestyle Gardening. I'm Kim Todd, and on today's show we'll be showing you how to use tall and skinny plants, how to grow succulents successfully, and we'll be looking at how to control squash pests. Let's start our program with some good pruning advice. Junipers and yews make good landscape plants, but sometimes they need a little attention from the pruning shears. Here's backyard farmer panelist Jeff Culbertson to help us decide where and when to cut.
After we get through the better part of the winter, one of the things we start looking at is doing some pruning around our landscape. There's a couple things to keep in mind when doing pruning. The first thing is we want to make sure that we don't jump the gun on it. We want to let the worst part of the winter get through before we do much in the way of pruning to our evergreens or deciduous shrubs and trees. As you go through and do some pruning on plants, you create little wounds as you do that work, and that just kind of opens the plant up to desiccation, drying out because of the lower humidity, the wind. Even in the wintertime, it warms up, cools down, so that just kind of draws more moisture out of the plant. So that's one of the things we want to think about that could cause additional damage to the plants. If you're thinking about doing pruning very early, you may stimulate growth, and that's why we want to avoid pruning too early in the fall. We want to make sure that we've gotten through that winter and into the last half of the winter, early part of spring. So normally when we do substantial pruning to plants, we're going to look at doing things end of February, first part of March into April before we have bud break. So once we got to that time of year, one of the things that we want to look at, especially with our evergreens, junipers and yews, let's take those two, and maybe even your boxwood, is making sure that we don't get too ambitious in our pruning. These plants many times don't recover very well from heavy pruning, so if you have a smaller plant, it's something that you want to do a little bit every early spring, late winter, and keep the plant the size you want to keep it. You don't want to allow it to get too large too quickly, because you'll open up what's kind of called the dead zone in the middle of the plant, and you don't want to cut into that because you'll expose holes in some areas that don't have live needles or leaves in it. So when we're looking at something like this, we'll come through and we'll prune this back, and I'll try to make my cuts so that I'm hiding those, so I'm not exposing those cuts, and you won't notice those as you walk by the plants. And so we'll look at doing that to kind of get this shape down a little bit and keep these plants the size that we'd like to keep them. With deciduous shrubs, it's the same idea. We've talked about before about caning larger shrubs, so taking a third of the largest canes out. And again, we're going to do that before bud break. And it's important that you know when your shrubs flower, so we want to avoid pruning certain shrubs that flower on very early in the spring. So those are ones that we may wait till after flower to do those shrubs. Shrubs that flower later in the summer, those are ones that we can look at doing a little bit more pruning in the late winter, early spring. So as we look around our yard and we look at some of the plants we have in our yard, common things like the lilac, which there are a selection of lilacs out there. Typically those are going to be some of our early flowering shrubs. We generally will recommend that we wait till after bloom to do some of that work. And so certainly you could wait till we get into the end of May, early June to go in and do some of that caning if you've noticed a reduction in flowering with lilacs. If you've already kind of had that issue with the lilacs, then I would say go in again early before they might bloom and do some of that work. Sometimes it's easier to work around shrubs when they don't have the leaves on, to kind of see exactly what you have and kind of get in there and be able to do some of that work just a little bit more easily. Viburnums are another one. With viburnums there are a variety of them that bloom early in the spring and then later in the summer. So again, it's knowing which one you have, remembering when the flowering was so you can do some of that work. But again, with some of these bigger shrubs, sometimes it is easier to get in there with the leaves off and do some of that work. You're just better able to see what you have and get the shape that you want. You may sacrifice some flowering that first year, but usually you're rewarded the next year with a little bit better show from those plants because you've taken some of that dead out, some of that older wood that isn't blooming as prolific as newer wood would bloom. So to kind of bring it all together, the other things to think about when we're doing that pruning that you could really do any time of the year is the things we've talked about in the past, and that is if you've got dead branches, broken branches, You know, particularly on campus, or if you have a lot of sidewalks around your property, we're always looking for things that may be a hazard to pedestrians. So it's that kind of work that really can be done anytime. It's not extensive pruning. We're not going to damage the plant by doing some of those things, where some of the things I'm talking about may be a little bit more comprehensive on the plant, and that's the stuff that we want to look at doing at the right time of year.
Timing is always going to be an essential part of good pruning, just as Jeff said. But if you see anything broken, rubbing together, or hazards around a sidewalk, it's going to be okay to take care of those problems any time of the year. All right, let's turn our attention over to growing succulents. This week, our Go Gardening feature is aimed at beginning gardeners who want to take a look at succulent plants that can grow in our Nebraska climate. You may have to stretch your mind a bit past thinking about just sedums to see that there are a myriad of choices that will do well here in the state, especially in containers. For this Go Gardening segment for our beginning gardeners, we thought we'd talk a little bit about succulents, either in the garden or in containers. They are increasing in popularity, certainly not decreasing. And there's some pretty good reasons for that. They're also not necessarily something that is going to be hard to grow, because they are one of those plants that if you set it and you forget it, you're going to probably have a little bit more success than you do if you really baby them to death. So what we're looking at is a whole bunch of the different succulents in a very large container, and then some of the little bitty ones that you can actually purchase and use either in containers, or you can set them in the soil in the garden, in the landscape, if it's hot, if it's dry, and more importantly, if it is really, really well drained. The ones that are in the big containers actually started out as these little guys. 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 years later, depending on how fast they grow, they turn into big, beautiful, wonderful textural plants that add an accent in containers, at the front door, on your patio, even against a pool or on a table. One of the things that they do not like is they do not like shade. And in this case, these live outside all summer long. And what happens with them then is we bring them in because we don't want to throw them in the compost pile. So they start to stretch and they get a little strange, and then we think, okay, can we make them live through the winter? We will pinch, we will root some of them, and we will put them back outside where they belong. You can almost do this indefinitely with some of the succulents, and some of them really do get monstrously huge. People are probably pretty well aware of jade plant as an example. There's a baby jade, and then of course there are jade plants that are really humongous and just have this great craggy, almost a bonsai sort of an appearance. The little guys, if you'll notice, they're in these interesting containers. The container itself, of course, is not interesting, but they're in these little bitty containers, and they have this gravel mix. So there is actually a fertilizer that you can use to give them some nutrition if necessary, but it's really that incredibly well-drained situation that makes the succulents grow best. I have a bag of that you can look at, and again, if you look at the differences in textures and in forms, some of them are going to bloom beautifully. You can combine them with cacti. You can again keep them indefinitely. We don't have a lot of succulents that are the wild and crazy ones that will survive outdoors in a garden situation. They're simply not hardy enough here, and we have too high of humidity and we have too much moisture oftentimes. The one that does come to mind, of course, is our regular sedums that are a go-to landscape plant. And essentially, it's the same sort of thing. It's the same family. It's this succulent foliage that is actually something that does not transpire readily, holds moisture in, almost like the hump on a camel, only instead this is plant material. So you have all sorts of options for succulents in dish gardens, in large containers, mixed in with other annuals or even perennials that really have the same sort of moisture and drainage requirements. Gives you a beautiful textural landscape in your garden. As you can see, there are plenty of options for you to try outside, especially in containers. Check out your local garden center for more ideas and have some fun with these unusual plants. For this week's landscape lesson, we're going to show you some innovative ways to use those tall and skinny plants. Grasses come to mind, but there are other woody options out there that will give you the same sort of structure in the landscape. We'll see a few good ways to put them to good use around your own home. For this week's landscape lesson, we thought we'd talk about tall, or sometimes short, but most definitely skinny plants. They definitely have a place in some landscapes, especially since so many of our smaller properties now leave us with 2 feet, 3 feet, maybe 5 feet between one residence and another, or between the property line or against a parking lot. So you have many, many choices, including overstory trees. Take, for example, prairie sentinel hackberry, which is about as wide as I am, maybe a little bit wider, but has a trunk and gets very, very tall. We have a lot of hybrid oaks that have been deliberately selected, bred, and then grafted to be able to have that tall, thin form. You use them much differently in the landscape than you would a big tree, and that would be they are a fence, a living fence. They are certainly a screen between your neighbor's property and yours, or some competing visual use. They also can definitely be a barrier. We have a lot of shrubs that are also narrow. They're a little bit harder to work with sometimes because they may not have multiple canes from the base, and that means if you get some damage or some death in one side, you're likely to lose the entire shrub. Hellman's pillar barberry is one that is very, very narrow and very thorny. There's one called orange rocket, which is very narrow, very thorny, and very orange. And then we have some upright fernleaf buckthorn that we're a little bit cautious about. We also have a lot of very narrow ornamental grasses or selections of our natives. Those are pretty cool. And they will, again, go into smaller spaces. They won't flop open or open up in a snow so much. Standing ovation little blue stem is one of the ones that come to mind. People love the really narrow evergreens. We have all sorts of spruce and some firs that are very, very narrow. The issue that you have to be aware of with those is those branches are essentially a cantilever, and a snow load or damage that causes weight on the ends of those branches can really cause them to open up. That's very, very difficult to get them to either come out of that on their own, or you really don't want your tall, narrow, skinny thing all twined up with duct tape to be able to hold it up in the landscape. If you have those narrow spaces in your own landscape, you can probably find a really good tall and skinny woody landscape plant that will give you that structure, make a nice accent, and actually live in that small environment. Your home landscape is a reflection of your own personal likes and dislikes. It's as much a part of who you are as the interior is. One Omaha Landscape Company takes a really unique approach to design, implementation, and management of home landscapes. Here to tell us more about that approach is Brian Kinghorn of Kinghorn Gardens. I'm really happy to have Brian Kinghorn with me today to be able to talk about his approach to landscape. So Brian, your company is really unique and has been unique from the start. Do you want to describe a little bit about why you decided to do that and what that approach is?
Well, I think we're strong in regards to sense of place and the development of that sense of place to actually mean something and to deliver a quality of life to the people or client or project that we interact with. And so when you sort of take it from that perspective and you draw inspiration from the site and you start to actually create spaces that have meaning and value to either the project, the place, or whatever the programming statement might be, you end up with a result that is purposeful, it's intentional, and it meets environmental needs, it meets maintenance capacity. So there's a lot of added benefits attached to the approach that we try to take.
So let's talk a little bit then about perhaps a small typical residential project that you have approached differently. Describe that for our audience.
Well, the first thing we're going to try to do is make sure that we meet a couple of the human aspects. And all the research and data indicates that there's two things that keep people from going outside. And those two things generally relate to it's too hot out there. That's one component. And the other one is it's too windy out there. So those, if we can, we're going to address the environmental concerns first in regards to the hot component and the wind component. And we're going to try to create spaces and places that people want to actually be in, and maybe extend their interaction with the outdoors. Maybe our goal or objective should be to try to get them outside 10 days earlier in the spring and 10 to 15 or 20 days longer in the fall, and create spaces where their length of time outdoors can be longer and more enjoyable, and it becomes maybe an extension of their home. It's not a to-do thing. It's something to interact with and be part of. And where I think we're naturally inclined, you know, it's part of one of the great plots in literature that it's man versus nature. Try to have a conversation with one of us about us being part of nature, you know, and that's a different conversation, because we constantly fight how we can be part of nature. We're always trying to control it.
How about an example of a project that is commercial or public or has really interesting elements of sustainability or natural or native environments in it?
There's more and more excitement right now about how you deal with what we consider to be negative space in the landscape. So the negative space historically or traditionally is taken up by an element of turf. And turf performs a great role in regards to, you know, occupying that negative space. But some people right now are asking for things that maybe aren't turf related. They could be meadows or glades or woodlands or prairie. Now, these are not exact replications of nature. These are abstract interpretations of nature, so that maybe they could end up with a negative space that directly relates to what they really want to look at. You know, because sometimes people are afraid or fearful of looseness and wildness. But we can actually take the plant material in the communities and the people that we have on board and the site and the desires and the programming statements, and we can create spaces that people truly want to look at that are dual purpose. Okay, so dual purpose meaning it's not just pretty and it's not just performing the function, but it also helps with other things that we need to be aware of. Now, our landscapes have to be more than just fashion shows. And so they have to be responsive to habitat, they have to be responsive to pollinators, they have to be responsive to your needs as a family or as a company or as a city. They have to be aware of, they have to be water wise, they have to be sensitive to that. You have to explain to us what your true maintenance capacity really is, and that has to coexist with the design program. So that's how we would approach it. And so that you would end up with spaces, again, that are attractive to look at. Let's say we have a meadow that you visually find interesting and it changes every 2 to 3 weeks. It has some patterning to it. It has some plant communities to it that relate to one another. We stretch the ideas, you know. I think people are more and more trying to figure out how they can participate in being good stewards of their own properties, of their own cities, and how we care for our landscapes, our neighborhoods, our environment.
Brian, you've added a head of horticulture to your business. That is also really unique. Do you want to describe why?
Well, maintenance capacity is critical, and it's one of those things that isn't all that sexy to talk about, you know, because who wants to talk about care or maintenance? And in fact, the term maintenance itself doesn't really excite people too much. But when we can really drill down to what a client's true maintenance capacity actually is, then we can start to design landscapes that will be able to meet that. So it's not one of these patronizing approaches anymore about, oh yeah, sure, don't worry about it, it'll be low maintenance. No, we're serious about what this looks like and how it coexists with the design process. So we have a head of horticulture now that's what they look at, and that's what they evaluate, and that's what they consider. And we have landscape architects and designers that start to really consider, well, what does this mean in regards to upkeep and care and inputs? And we can match maintenance capacity with outcome. We now have an understanding about how to do that, and it's not as complicated as one might think. The complicated part is for us to get good, honest information up front about what your inputs are actually going to be, and so we can match those if we have good dialogue and information that we can harvest.
Brian, that's really exciting to think about into the future. I want to thank you an awful lot for coming down today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks, Brian. We really appreciate the idea that your outdoor living space is much more like an actual habitat. Thinking of these principles can help you make better choices. They can bring you years of comfort and beauty around your home. All right, let's take a few minutes to answer your emails. You can submit your questions, your JPEG pictures as attachments via email to byf@unl.edu. Our first question comes from a lakeside viewer. We're not entirely sure which lake. They do have a cabin. They sent us a picture from last fall. So interestingly enough, here it is February. They're already thinking ahead to hoping that this does not happen again. They had their hostas right against the edge of their deck, as you can see, eaten off by something. It's highly unusual for this kind of damage to be done by anything other than a rabbit, a wascally wabbit. Now they also have roly-polies associated with these hostas. People do think that roly-polies eat only debris, dead and decaying matter. We've actually seen them go after especially the roots of some plants in our backyard farmer landscape and on campus, and it could very well be that they're seeing some damage down in the crown of the plant that is due to the roly-polies. If this is slug damage, you'd see the classic sort of raggedy holes in the leaves. You'd also see the slime trails that the slugs leave. So, long story short on this one, if you don't want the rabbits to get them, you're going to have to exclude the rabbits either at the edge of your property or cage each one of those plants or that entire hosta bed. If it's roly-polies and slugs, you can lay down burlap, you can collect the slugs in particular and then drown them, salt them. Again, just make sure you keep that environment cleaned out for the roly-polies. Our next question comes from Garden Valley, Idaho. They have evergreens that the green needles are falling off of. So the first question always is, what is going on in the location, in the environment? Is there something about that location that those evergreens do not like? Oftentimes what it is it's a change in drainage, in particular, drowning those trees. But typically it wouldn't just be the green needles falling off bright green, it would be a little bit of yellowing going on as well. But I do know that we are seeing an awful lot of damage that is, again, squirrel related, where they're nipping off the entire ends of pines, sometimes spruce and fir, maybe 6 to 12 inches long. They're actually dropping those on the ground as opposed to taking them up into the trees for nesting material. We're seeing a lot of that kind of damage. So the ideal situation here would be to take a look and see if you can see those gnaw marks or those angular cuts where the critters have actually taken those branches off, or whether in fact it is something a little more unusual than that. We're going to end our 2018 season of Lifestyle Gardening with a feature about controlling squash pests. If you grow zucchini, squash, pumpkins, or any other sort of gourd-like plant, you know you're likely going to have to fight off these bugs. Fortunately, we have that dynamic duo of backyard farmer panelists Jonathan Larson and Jody Green to help us keep those bugs away from our produce.
Lots of people are anxious to get out into the garden right now. I know it's cold, it's snowy, it's gross outside, and they're thinking about what to buy and what to plant, and people are going out and getting their seeds. Everybody I've met in Nebraska really likes to plant vine crops. I've met a lot of people who do squash and zucchinis and pumpkins. And when you grow those kinds of plants, you have to worry about the old squash vine borer, which is a pretty nasty pest. What does it look like, Jody?
Well, it's about 1/2 inch long, and it looks like a wasp, but it's really a day-flying moth. They're red and silver, but as larvae, they're little white caterpillars. And that's what does the damage. Can you explain what the damage looks like?
Well, the caterpillar is the damaging stage, and they hatch out from their egg and they bore their way into the base of the plant and they feed inside of the stem. So you usually can't see them, but you can see the plant wilting down the vine because they're eating the part of the plant that's transporting water and nutrients. It kind of wilts and looks really cruddy. And you may also notice a hole in the vine where some orange goo is exuding from. And this is the caterpillar's poop or frass that's moving out of the plant. They kind of push it out. They're tidy in that way. They don't want to live in their own poo. And you'll see that before you see a lot of the other kinds of symptoms. And once you see that, you're going to want to control them somehow, or you may want to take some preventative steps. So what could they do to prevent this damage, Jody?
Well, one of the things you should do first is probably monitor to see if you have the squash vine borer in your garden. So you can put out a yellow bowl, because they're really attracted to that yellow color, a bowl with water and soap. And if you can catch 2 or 3 moths, then I would do a treatment where you would use aluminum foil and flatten it out and wrap this, not too tight, but wrap it around the vine so that the female moth can't lay the egg, so that it can't bore into the vine. Do you want to tell me a little bit more about chemical treatments?
There are several products that we could use to try and prevent the damage from squash vine borer. If you don't want to do the foil option, you could go to the base of your plant and you could use a liquid application of carbaryl or bifenthrin, sprayed right at that base of the plant, like 1 to 2 inches up, and then when the female lands, she'll get the residue on her and it will kill her, or when the babies hatch out, it'll kill them when they try to get into the plant. But if you don't get that stuff on there preventatively and you get the caterpillar inside, there is one sort of drastic option that we can do. You can perform vine surgery, which sounds drastic, but we're both doctors, so we can pull this off. You just find the spot where the plant is infested, where you see the orange goo coming out. You take a sharp, clean knife and you make a vertical slit in the vine, pull it open. Jody's going to pull out our fake caterpillar here. Do you let it go, or do you destroy it?
No, you destroy it.
Yeah, get your revenge on it, get rid of it, and then you seal that plant back together, just squish it together and bury the dirt over the top of that, and you hope that it fuses together, re-roots in that spot, and you get squash or pumpkins or whatever it is that you're growing. Doesn't always work, but it's better than not trying anything at all.
You know what else?
What else?
Well, because over winter, what are they doing? They are underground, overwintering as pupae.
Correct.
Or a pupa. So you would really want to rotate your crops so you don't plant your squash in that same place.
Always a good policy. IPM practices, right?
Yes.
So we hope that helps everybody that wants to grow some squash, some delicious food this summer, and helps you to keep this pesky pest away.
Yes.
Thanks, guys. We look forward to clean squash and zucchini plants this spring. Thank you so much for joining us again for Lifestyle Gardening this year. Remember, if you've missed any of the previous programs, you can always go to the Backyard Farmer YouTube channel for this and many other great videos. And be sure to keep in touch with us on our Facebook page. Don't forget to mark your calendars for April 5th, when Backyard Farmer returns for its 66th season. So good afternoon, good gardening. We'll see you all in a few weeks for Backyard Farmer.